Most artists, and especially architects, have some schooling in art before they reach and develop their own particular style. Both architects and artists are usually aware of and interested in the work of their contemporaries, and mindful of the prevailing standards in the culture where they intend to sell their work. The architect often has to respond to the financial needs and the aesthetic ideas of the client who pays the bills. And those ideas are usually formed by looking at buildings that already exist. From this comes style and fashion in design, and the recognizable look of a certain place and period. Thus, we have Egyptian, Greek, Renaissance, and Baroque styles. Often, particularly in architecture, these factors combine to produce buildings that have a sameness to them and can be mass-produced. In fact, it is historically unusual for an architect to produce work that looks nothing like its neighbors and nothing like what has been done before. When this does happen, the artist and builder are often considered foolish or even mad. This sort of product is often called outsider art. The French call it art brut, literally raw art. Outsider art is by definition surprising and extraordinary. It can also be beautiful and instructive. The architect Antoni Gaudi, who lived and worked in Barcelona, Spain, at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th centuries, produced outsider art, especially towards the end of his career. Although he was educated as a young man in traditional schools, in time he began to rethink the whole basis of art and design. For example, Gaudi abandoned the traditional way of designing his proposed buildings. Most architects in the Western world begin by making plans on paper. Usually these plans involve straight lines with right angles and tried and true conventional engineering. Often, the shapes they use to describe their new buildings are variations on basic geometric forms: squares, rectangles, triangles, cones, and the like. Most architects, in fact, use the same two basic tools: the compass, which produces clean circles, and the square, which produces right angles. Antoni Gaudi based his ideas on how to construct a building on his observations of nature. He found few straight lines in the natural world, but instead a complex intersection of curved lines and volumes, which was seldom repeated. He thought buildings should evolve as bodies do, with complicated curves and struts and connectors. They should look more like human bones, muscles and tendons, than girders and planks. Although he had classical training as an architect, he soon moved away from making drawings on paper and began making ingenious models to describe his buildings. Basing his forms on simple but novel constructions, such as leaves or bones, he hung carefully weighted strings from a cutout of the footprint of the building. Using mirrors, or just his imagination, he turned those weighted curves upside down. Their curved distortions thus told him how to form his columns and arches without using the mathematics and formulas of traditional engineering. This gave the building a most unusual form, but one that made perfect sense from the point of view of natural forces. These soaring arches are immensely strong. They don't look like the corbelled arches of prehistory, or like the round Roman arches, or like the pointed Gothic arches. They are something entirely new. Gaudi's masterpiece, the Church of the Holy Family in Barcelona, looks unlike any church in the long history of Christian building. It has towers, but these look like pillars of wet sand poured by a child making sandcastles on the beach with a bucket and spade. Yet these forms are extremely solid and stable. Their balance is based on the same laws of gravity that form dripped sand. His builders do not work from plans and drawings, but instead from an enormous handmade model in the basement of the church. This model was in fact deliberately destroyed during the Spanish Civil War and has since been reconstructed by successive architects. This fascination with natural forms is a characteristic shared by many outsider architects. Throughout Gaudi's work run the tendrils and trunks of growing things, the movements of waves or foliage or of water, as seen here in Barcelona's Parc Güell. These are the wrought iron fences outside his house in Parc Güell. Sometimes his forms come unaltered from nature. Other times they are modified or extended according to Gaudi's intentions. Looking at his work reminds us that the outsider artist very often executes his or her own work, and by hand, rather than using an industrial machine. But as Gaudi was a builder and architect of large structures, he was an exception to this rule. He used many skilled workmen, and he usually had more than enough financial support. Yet he did come from a background of goldsmiths and ironworkers, and a hand-wrought, one-of-a-kind quality persists in his designs. Like many outsiders, Gaudi had few friends and clients, but those he did have were extremely close to him. The wealthy Mr. Güell was his greatest patron. He supported the construction of the Güell estate and crypt, and the great public space, Parc Güell itself, in Barcelona. The outsider artist is often aware of traditional styles, and sometimes even incorporates them in his work. But the old forms are used in radically different ways. For example, in Parc Güell, there is a forest of Greek columns, which support not a roof, but a great open floor. From this elevation, you can see the city of Barcelona, with Gaudi's park buildings in the foreground. The open space is enclosed and surrounded by undulating seats made of concrete and surfaced with broken tile. The area attracts sunbathers and children. Beneath the sunbathers are the columns. Their outer ranks do not stand straight as we expect from thousands of years of Greek tradition, but rather lean inwards. This surprise makes sense from a structural point of view, as they are resisting the outer thrust of the floor above. Deeper inside, they become straight again. But they nonetheless surprise and delight us, as old forms taking on new meaning. A forest of renegade columns, a place to explore, to investigate, and to hide in. A very different experience than the regimented order and repetition of the Greek temple. Other areas of Parc Güell remind us that objects created by an outsider artist often look like nothing we've seen before. They are brand new things from an original mind. These might be described as arcades, and their forms are something like the stalactites of a cave and something like the connective tissue of a body. Their use is not clear. It is for us to investigate and invent. Other areas are like caves, developed from the hillside of the park and overgrown with grass and vines. They stir in the visitor the memories of the ancient shared past of mankind. Outsider architecture often employs forms drawn directly from nature: animals, human faces, helmets, and the like. The surfaces of Gaudi's buildings, like La Pedrera, may surge and intersect like waves of an ocean. On the roof, the chimney and air vents are like the heads of old warriors, their helmets gilded with reused materials. Ceramic surfaces are a common characteristic of outsider artists. The outstanding shared quality of outsider artists is a sense of isolation, of distance from the affairs and concerns and even family associations of more ordinary mankind. Coupled with this may come an obsession with work and art, a passion for making and building, which replaces ordinary human ties and concerns. At one end of this spectrum is creative insanity, the inability to communicate in any ordinary way. Sometimes this ends with a life in an institution. Gaudi was far from this. He lived for many years with his niece, and he had close friends and supporters, particularly in the Güell family, throughout his life. Yet, as he grew older, he did become more detached and more obsessive. After both his niece and his patron Güell died, he concentrated every waking hour on his church. He worked, ate, and slept within its walls. He was a deeply religious man, and this church was the ultimate expression of his faith. The twisting towers, the tallest of which is 170 meters and capped with a gigantic cross, symbolize the worshipper's heavenly aspirations. There a pilgrim can begin a torqued journey towards heaven. Each tower has a spiral stair, and these twist and swirl like the inner shell of God's chambered nautilus. It is a roller coaster ride in carved stone, and even young people get dizzy. Connectors, which are spaced along the spiral like leaves rotating around a plant stem. Their spacing determined by the numbers of the famous Fibonacci series, intersect and cross over and echo each other in mirror image reverse, for all the world like the famous DNA molecule, the genetic key to all life. Yet nearly 70 years will pass, along with 2 world wars and the atom bomb, before the mind-shattering discovery of DNA by Watson and Crick. It is an extraordinary case of an outsider artist predicting discoveries in science, which in turn echo forms which most thinkers agree have evolved over millions of years. Gaudi believed to the core of his soul that the beautiful forms of nature were a gift from God himself. The Church of the Holy Family was begun in 1882 and only partly finished at Gaudi's death in 1926. As he grew older, his dress became shabby, and he wandered the streets of Barcelona as if in a dream. At last, a streetcar ran him down. It was some time before his worn body was identified as the visionary architect, whose creations are an essential part of Barcelona's fame around the world. The church has been rising for close to a century and a half, yet it is not yet complete. When will it be done? There is no hurry. The Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris took nearly 200 years to finish. A fire of faith drove those builders through the years. The same power drives the builders of the Sagrada Familia. It is surely the obsessive energy and focus of artists like Gaudi, free of earthly concerns, that can generate such dedication.